Hello, welcome back to the Supply Change Podcast. My name is Ben Santiago, the executive producer here at Aptricity. We just want to thank you so much for tuning in. Quick caveat for today's episode, we did have some small technical difficulties with one of the mics. We worked through it, clipped it together to make it as best as we could, and decided to keep some of that content in just because it's too good to leave out. We thank you ahead of time for bearing with us. If you have any questions, responses, feedback, or anything like that, please submit it in the Q&A section found on Spotify. If not on Spotify, message us at social@aptricity.com. And without further ado, here's today's episode.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Supply Change Podcast brought to you by Aptricity. I am your host, Christian Garcia. We are incredibly excited today to be introducing our first interview, and this is a very exciting interview that we have planned for you guys. Our guest today was the lunar module pilot of the Apollo 16 mission. He's the 10th man to walk on the moon. He also served on Capcom for the Apollo 10 and 11 missions. You are still the youngest person to have walked on the moon. And you spent over 265 hours in space, over 21 hours in extravehicular activity. And as I read off those accomplishments, what I actually admire the most is the humility that you show and how approachable you are, because you've done some pretty incredible things in your life. But it's truly inspirational how humble you are about that. Charlie, thank you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure, Christian. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
Yeah, we were joking around before we started recording that whoever the next interview is has a pretty tough act to follow. So, we're thankful that you're here on your birthday of all days. So happy birthday.
Thank you very much. It's started out a great day. Looking forward to celebrate. Unfortunately, we got a physical tomorrow, so we got to start fasting at 7 o'clock tonight, so we can't party today. So tomorrow when we get home, we'll have a little party.
That'll be good. Yeah. Well, basically what we'll do for this interview is we'll talk a little bit about your early life and career, your career with NASA, and then we'll have a second episode planned on the supply chain of getting a man to the moon. So really the format for this episode, we'll probably divide this into 2 different episodes and then potentially have a supercut with both. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about your career, and then we'll take a pause and we'll talk about everything that it took to get a man to the moon, because I imagine it was quite a lot of groups working together to get somebody up there.
It was true, yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's dive in. So your father served in the Navy following the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Then you attended the Naval Academy. Then you decided to join the Air Force. So what made you want to join the Air Force after all that naval experience?
Well, I wasn't particularly fond of sea duty. I had a tendency to get seasick on the cruises we did back in those days from Annapolis on the summer cruises. And I fell in love with airplanes. The Naval Academy had 3 pre-World War II open cockpit yellow perils, they call them, N3N. And so they put you in the front seat. They gave you some familiarization rides. And they put you in the front seat, and the instructor got in the back seat, and open cockpit, bi-wing, pontoons on these things, and they pushed it off, and you taxied out and across Severn River and took off flew over. Anyway, I fell in love with airplanes, flying them a little bit and just having that wind, and it was just fantastic. So I said, I'm going to be a pilot. Yeah. So back then, there wasn't an Air Force Academy.
Right.
And they would allow 25% of West Point and Annapolis to volunteer for the Air Force each year. And so I had a choice, naval aviation or Air Force pilot. And I was really undecided. I was leaning Air Force, but because of seasick, Navy stuff, but I wasn't sure. And but then I had a physical my senior year, first class year they called it, and the doctor said I had astigmatism in my right eye and I didn't qualify for naval aviation, but the Air Force will take you. So that was the decision point. So I chose to go in the Air Force, and then I spent 30 years, 29, 30 years in the Air Force Reserve and active duty. And I never regretted my decision. It was tremendous. And it's sort of a God thing, really, because since that physical in 1957 till today, I can't tell you how many physicals I had, but hundreds. And nobody's ever seen astigmatism in my right eye since that time. So it put me into the Air Force, and I never looked back. It was tremendous. I got a lot of friends that are Naval Academy graduates that are naval officers and naval aviators. We had a class full of 25% filled. We filled our quota in our class for Air Force. Not all pilots, but a lot of us were.
That's interesting because I know, following up on that, NASA was founded in 1958, and so at the time, you were now in the Air Force at that point. And
That's correct.
Did you really know, or what were really your initial reactions to the founding of NASA? Because that was Dwight D. Eisenhower who founded it, right?
Let me back up a little bit.
Sure.
I was in flight school at Spence Air Base in Georgia and soloed in September of 1957. The next month, Sputnik went up.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And that was the beginning of the space age in my recollection. And I said, wow, that is really amazing. And then the space race began to heat up. And we were trying to get things airborne, but the rockets were blowing up and there were a lot of problems. So then in 1958, NASA was formed to sort of consolidate all the efforts of space flight for the U.S. As a civilian agency. Didn't take over the military side, but it took over the civilian side.
Sure.
I was assigned to Germany as a fighter interceptors pilot in May of 1959. And in that year, also, then the first astronauts were selected that year. Okay. And they were going to fly Mercury. It was the program, this one man in this spacecraft launched on actually a ballistic missile. Oh, yeah. But it got him into space. That was the beginning as I was transitioning now to a fighter squadron. I said, man, that'd be a great job. But I mean, I didn't have any experience. Right. I was a junior guy, and a lieutenant. And so I really didn't think about it, but it motivated me later on. I was really impressed in those days that NASA was finally the U.S. was finally getting going in the space program and in the manned space flight.
Yeah, so would you say that there was a pretty general understanding, we're founding NASA to get a man to the moon? Was that really the initial response?
It wasn't to get them to the moon. It was to get organized in the manned space flight, plus unmanned stuff. So NASA took over the civilian side of space flight for the United States. And the charter of NASA is no military involvement. So you couldn't fly military missions. You could use a military rocket to get into space, but NASA had to buy it and configure it like they wanted for first Mercury and then Gemini. So one man and then two man. So when I get to Germany, the things were failing, but they were trying to get into orbit. It turned out we launched Vanguard and finally got a satellite in orbit. And then in 1961, we got a shot in April of that year because Yuri Gagarin, the Russian cosmonaut, orbited the Earth. And so we were caught flat-footed, basically. But 2 weeks later, Alan Shepard went up in his suborbital up and down. And so we finally had a man in space. And then 2 weeks later, President Kennedy announced the Apollo program, which I thought was a bold move. Yeah. 15 minutes in space, and he's committing us to the moon. But NASA, especially Werner von Braun, said the only way we're going to really beat the Russians is get to the moon first. And so that was the whole focus. NASA's civilian agency, using some military hardware, but flying their own spacecraft and with their own scientific missions.
Right. So You mentioned that you were stationed. It was at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany.
Overseas, you can't call them Air Force Base. It was Air Base.
Air Base. Air Base. That's right.
And I was there for 3 years from May of 59 to 62.
Okay.
And not only was the space race heating up with Gagarin and Shepard, but also that year, in 61 or so, the Berlin Wall was built. So there's a lot of tension, and we were sitting alert, but a great job. I loved it. We flying F-102s at the end, and so it was an exciting job. But then I decided my time was up in May of 62, and the Air Force wanted me to go back to graduate school. So I applied under the Air Force Institute of Technology, and they were going to send me to some civilian university. Mm-hmm. So they gave you 3 choices, list your 3 choices. So my first was Georgia Tech, then NC State because I'm from the South.
Right.
And the third was MIT. Well, you always get your third, it seemed like. So I ended up at MIT, which was a very hard 2 years.
Oh, I'm sure.
MIT was nothing like the Naval Academy as far as academics go. And so I struggled, but I managed to graduate. Started in May of 62, graduated 2 years later in June of 64. Got married, met my wife, Dorothy. Mm-hmm. We're still together now, 59 years later. We got married in June of 63. And we had our first year of marriage at MIT in Boston.
That's great. And I have in my notes that you studied aeronautics and astronautics at MIT. So could you kind of explain what those studies are?
Well, MIT had that department of aeronautics and astronautics. And the aeronautics side, MIT was very strong in inertial measurement systems, IMU, gyroscopes, very big in the electronic side of aeronautics. And then the astronautics side of it was more of application of that into space. MIT had, during World War II, had the instrumentation lab, radar control gun sights. Radar control guns were based on their system of gyroscopes and all. And so they were big in gyroscopes. So when I got there, they actually had won the contract to build the Apollo guidance and navigation system. And so I was looking for a thesis. And MIT had built this guidance and navigation system, which required very fine-tuned pilot input. And they didn't know whether anybody could really do it or not. Yeah. So they got us 2 pilots, Air Force pilots, to be the subjects.
Sure.
And so we developed a program to gain data. Can a pilot, a human being, really do this task? And so we had 3 months of data. It was really a statistical analysis of this system. And it turned out it was easy to do. A pilot could maneuver it. It was well designed. And so we ended up getting 3 months of data. And we had some assistance from a PhD in statistics to help us. What are we going to do with all this? Anyway, we got some help from this guy and did a real good job with the thesis. And NASA accepted it. I met some astronauts. They came up to view the system and how does it work, and we got to brief them. And they were very motivated guys like Don Isley and Charlie Bassett and others. So I said, well, how did I get your job?
Yeah.
I said, God, yeah, I never met anybody like you guys who are so motivated in your job. And so they suggested I finish my degree, then go to test pilot school, and you might have a chance, he said, after that. So I followed their advice. And
so you joined the test pilot school. I had a quick question because I wasn't around in the 80s. I was born in the 90s. But Top Gun is obviously a huge thing, especially with the reboot that just happened. So test pilot school, was this Top Gun before Top Gun?
Not really. Test pilot A test pilot is very, very fine precision flying. Mm-hmm. It's not G's. It's they teach you have a profile. You're to fly this airplane, and you're to be at, let's say, 20,000 feet, mm-hmm. plus or minus 20 feet, plus or minus 360 knots. No, not at 360 knots, plus or minus 2 knots on either side. Wow. So it's very precise. Right. And you get your point, your data point, and then you wiggle a stick or you kick the rudders, they want to see what the airplane does at the whole envelope of it. Right. So you build the envelope of the airplane. It can fly this slow and this high, or it can fly this fast, and so that's called the envelope of the airplane. As long as you keep it in that envelope, you got a controllable airplane. You get beyond that, the airplane could diverge. Right. To uncontrollable flight. So it was very, very precise flying. And we had various airplanes that we flew. And that kind of training, first year, 6 months, was to learn how to be a real test pilot. Mm-hmm. The second 6 months was called aerospace flying and how to fly in space. We had a simulator, how do you do orbital mechanics and all of that kind of stuff. And so that was the aerospace side of it back in those days. Our boss was Chuck Yeager, who was a very famous test pilot, and he was coming into the school. I graduated from test pilot school in the summer of 1965, and the very next month, NASA had another call for astronauts. So I was perfect. My timing was perfect. Yeah. Not because my timing was, but it just turned out that way. And so I applied, and 4 of us in our test pilot school class got selected. And so in April of 1966, we moved to Houston. Charles, our first son, had been born at Edwards Air Force Base. We reported to Houston in April of 1966 and started our career, and for me, the next 10 years of being an astronaut.
Yeah, so I saw this fact online, and I honestly couldn't believe it, that you found the posting for that NASA was recruiting on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Is that true?
It was an article.
Wow.
I would call it a recruitment article, because it was the little headline was NASA has another astronaut selection. Mm-hmm. And it listed when it started and when to apply and how to apply, and it gave the qualifications. Right. You know, you had to be a U.S. citizen, you had to be a man, you had to be less than 6 feet tall or thereabout. You had to have a college degree. You had to have 1,500 hours flying time. Mm-hmm. And those are very generic requirements. So half our test pilot school applied. And as I said, 4 of us got selected for the Apollo program. Then we had interviews, we had physical, we had to go to the School of Aviation Medicine. Once NASA, well, first off, the Air Force, you applied and the Air Force had to approve you. Mm-hmm. If the Air Force approved you, they sent your application to NASA. Colonel Yeager approved us. They said these guys are qualified. And then the Air Force headquarters approved us. And we got sent. I don't know how many Air Force guys got sent from Edwards. There were 19 of us selected, and probably 7 or 8 of us were from Edwards Air Force Base. Various jobs we had there. So in April of 66, we passed the physical, we passed the interviews, and we were down to a couple of hundred guys, and now they were interviewing us to see your motivation, I guess. March of that year, Deke Slayton, one of the original astronauts, was head of the flight crew operations. He called, he says, "Charlie, we'd like you to come work for us. Do you still want a job?" And I jumped out of my shoes, you bet, man. I was so excited and that I'd gotten selected. And my wife was very excited about moving to Houston, where there's some trees and, no desert. And and we, little baby. And so we moved to Houston, and that started my career in April 1966.
Yeah, that's great. I was joking around earlier with Ben that posting a job description for NASA on the front page of the LA Times, it's almost like football teams that have open tryouts. You get a bunch of people who apply, and you're like, oh, this guy's not, he's not.
Well,
really
that's the way they got the people.
Yeah.
Later on, when it opened to women had been selected starting in '78, but now this is in the '80s, and it was wide open. And they said, we're selecting a group of new group of astronauts. They had 18,000 applications. Wow. They picked 12. I said, how did you guys filter 18,000 applications to get down to 12 selections? He said it was pretty hard. And women have done a great job.
I want to go back to something you said about being a fighter pilot, because I imagine at the time that was really the closest thing there was to simulating, or at least representing the amount of G's that you would experience during takeoff. Really, the only closest thing you had was flying a jet. Is that right?
Well, either that being an acrobatic pilot, they had pit specials and others like plays like that. You could pull a lot of G's. But as far as the military goes, a jet fighter was the closest to. But an airplane, the G is this way. In space, the G is this way because you're accelerating and you're in a couch looking at an instrument panel. The engine's behind you, and it's pushing you this way, so you push back in your seat. Right. So it's the G level is a little bit different. But Apollo did have an abort. You got the second stage took you to 100 miles, and then it dropped off. But you were way short of orbital velocity. So when it dropped off, if the third stage didn't ignite, down you came, and it was a 20 G.
Oh my goodness!
Reentry, so they said, "Well, we're going to put you in a centrifuge, and we're not going to take you to 20, but we're going to take you to 15." That's a good simulation. Yeah. And I mean, sitting there at 15 Gs, it felt like your skin's being ripped off your feet. Very difficult to expand your chest to get a breath in at 15 Gs. And but they took you up to 15 and there for a second or two and then back down again. It wouldn't have been fun to do 20 G reentry on that abort. So fortunately, nobody had to do it. Nobody aborted. Once you got airborne in Apollo, nobody aborted during the ascent. Every one of us made it into orbit. The only real problem we had was Apollo 13 when it blew up on the way to the moon. And that was a critical situation, but we recovered them safely.
Well, let's dive a little bit more into your NASA career, but before we do that, we'll take a quick break. All right, we're back with astronaut Charlie Duke, and we're going to dive a little bit more into your NASA career now. I know that we talked a little bit about that before break. Really, the first question where I want to start this is you were selected for Capcom on both the Apollo 10 and 11 missions, and this was pretty rare at the time, was it not?
Yeah, it was rare. Generally, the Capcom is a member of what was called a support crew. Back in those days, NASA had 3 crews on every mission. They had a prime crew who was selected to fly the mission, then had a backup crew that was trained in parallel with the prime crew, and if something happened to the prime crew, backup crew would take their place. Then the next crew was the support crew, and that was 3 astronauts, and you were the gophers. You went to this meeting, you went to that meeting. And one of the jobs was Capcom. I was on the team to develop the lunar module activation and checkout and the descent procedures. So I went on the team, the mission control team as Capcom, that was to do that job. When Apollo 10 it was the first time we took the lunar module to the moon, and the idea was to power up the lunar module, separate, get ready, start the descent, but then abort and come back up again. No landing attempt. The lunar module would not land, so it wasn't even fully fueled, but it was enough to start down and back up again. And so I was there for that part of the mission on Apollo 10, and the flight director was Gene Kranz. Their team was going to move over now to Apollo 11 2 months later and be the team that would actually assist to land the lunar module on the lunar surface. Apollo 11, which was going to be Armstrong and Aldrin. Well, I wasn't a support crew for that, but we had a meeting one time, and Krantz and myself and several others and Neil Armstrong, and Neil said, "Charlie, why don't you do this?" And Krantz said, "Yeah, he did a good job on the last one. Let's ask him to be Capcom for the landing part." So I was on that team, and it was, I think, Gold Team or whatever it was. It was Krantz's car. And so we trained for 2 months to get ready to go for that first landing. I got really familiar with the operation of mission control, how it operated. You know, you listened with one ear into the what's called a MCC, Mission Control Center loop. And that was all the flight directors, flight controllers and flight directors talking. And the director, Krantz, was sort of the conductor of all of that. And then I'm listening this ear, and then to this ear, I'm listening to the crew and what they're talking and the questions they're asking. Everybody else hears that, but nobody can respond except for the Capcom. So it all went well during the training, and activation and checkout went well. Then the actual descent, we started having some major problems.
Yeah. So can you go into a little detail about what those problems were upon the descent?
There were 4 major problems. The first was a communication problem. We had an antenna that was an omni that transmitted in every direction, and we had what's called a high gain, and it had to be pointed right at the Earth to get all the data and everything like that. But we was having comm problems, so we kept reorienting the spacecraft. The mission rule said if you lost data for 30 seconds, you were aborting. So it was important to get that data back. And then as we started down after that, we started having computer overloads. When I saw that 201 or whatever the alarm was, and I saw that alarm, I said, "Oh God, we're dead. You know, we got to abort. We don't have a computer." But mission control guy, Steve Bales, and the guy in the back room named Jack Garman, they hollered out, "Your go flight," on that alarm. They had all the computer alarms in a matrix.
Yeah.
We're go on that one, but we're no go on this one, you know.
Right.
So all the way down, we kept having these alarms. Well, the alarms were that the computer was overloaded, but it was still operating, but it was overloaded. And the Apollo computer worked on like a 75 millisecond compute cycle.
Okay.
So it'd queue up the jobs.
Right.
You know, the important ones at the top, and it'd go down to, and when it got to the end of the 75 milliseconds or whatever it was, it'd flip back to the top and not do the bottom jobs. Well, that was overload. Yeah. But it was still operating. And so they figured that out, and so we continued our descent. And then at 7,500 feet above the moon, the lunar module pitches over, and you can see the crew can see the moon for the first time. And we had them targeted into a big boulder field. The lunar targeting wasn't very sophisticated at that time. Neil said, "We can't land here," so he levels off about 500 feet above the moon and flies several miles down range till that looks good. So he pitches up, slows down, and starts down. That resulted in minimum fuel.
Oh, sure.
So he used all the reserve to fly to this spot. So we start down, and there was a minimum fuel level that we had established. When we got to that level, we were going to abort. Well, we gave 60 seconds warning till we got to that level. The flight controller said, "Flight 60 seconds," and I hollered up, "60 seconds, Eagle." Then he said, "Flight 30 seconds," and I said, "Eagle, 30 seconds." So they're close, but not on the ground. And about 13 seconds later, I heard Buzz Aldrin say, "Contact, engine stop." And man, they're on the ground. So it's basically 17 seconds to the abort call we landed. Now, that wouldn't mean you're going to be out of gas.
Yeah.
This means that was the minimum cutoff we'd established. So if we'd have called an abort, Neil Armstrong had the final decision. He could throttle up, use that fuel to go up, start a positive rate of climb, but he's only 20 feet off the moon. So why don't he use that fuel to land? So he never had to make that decision, but that was, and I'm convinced if we'd have said Eagle abort, he would have landed the lunar module, made the decision to land.
Yeah.
And so we had a successful landing, but it was tension in mission control. I mean, through the roof. You couldn't, dead silence, but I mean, everybody was glued to their console. And to be honest, the tension during the Apollo 11 landing was higher, in my view, with me, than it was actually landing on the moon.
Really?
2 years later.
Huh.
Because you're looking at a little screen and you're hearing all of this, and you don't have the big visual picture of what they're seeing.
Right.
And so it was just high tension. And that's why when they landed, I had a comment that said, Neil came on very calm, says, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't even pronounce tranquility.
That's a tough word.
Twang, it came out. Tranquility, I corrected myself. Roger, Tranquility, we copy on the ground. You got a bunch of guys that turning blue with breathing again. We were literally holding our breath. So everybody cheered, but then flight director got us back to work, because if we'd have sprung a leak in the ascent engine tank or something like that, we had to lift off immediately.
Right.
So we had everybody monitored their systems, and we had a T1, T2, T3, whatever it was. And T1 was like a couple of minutes after landing. And we gave them a go for that. Everything looked good. Then 30 minutes later, there was going to be another check. Everything was still good. So finally, we got out to about an hour, I guess it was, and everything looked good. So we said, okay, we'll stay. So now they start configuring the spacecraft for the 24-hour stay on the moon. About that time, we went off duty, and another team came on. So I wasn't there during the actual step onto the moon or the moonwalk. I was home with my family watching it on TV, like 2 billion other people.
Yeah.
But it was exciting.
Yeah, I can only imagine a couple of things. One, being 20 feet and you're hovering, and it's like, to make the decision to go back, it's you can't even fathom making that decision if you had to. It's almost like that decision wasn't even possible at the time.
Well, I'm convinced that if I'd have said we'd have got to the end of that 30 seconds and I said Eagle abort, there would have been dead silence on the other end. And it would finally, they said, say again, Houston, we didn't understand that call. About that time, they would have been landed. Right. So,
yeah, and then just the amount of tension and anxiety in the room. I've never been in anything remotely close to that, but there's a feeling that you get. It's a shared feeling, right? With everybody being so focused on that central goal, it's a feeling that gets spread throughout the room, and everybody feels it if you're in that presence.
It was the most tension I'd ever felt in mission control. I was there for Apollo 10, Apollo 11, and I was back up on Apollo 13 and Apollo 17. And during the flight, the backup crew's in mission control for all the critical maneuvers. And so you're sitting there, you don't have any role except an advisory role. But you get involved in all of these decisions and things that are happening, especially on Apollo 13, When the thing blew up on the way to the moon, now we're down to the lunar module has got to bring them home. And we got to get them back in orbit by firing the lunar module, not in orbit, get them back on a trajectory that would bring them back to the Earth. And so John Young and I jumped up and we ran to the simulator. And an hour later, we had the procedures, or 2 hours, whatever it was. So we came back and then I got on Capcom at that point and briefed the crew on what they had to do. And it was a long set of procedures. And then Mattingly had done the same thing for the command module. And so he read up that, and then we got him back on this return trajectory. But so you're there, but you're very rare. You give advice, but you're not actually on the team.
And Mattingly was supposed to be on the Apollo 13 mission. Is that right?
Yeah, I exposed him to the measles about a week before the launch, I think, and maybe 10 days, don't remember. But everybody had the measles in the prime crew and the backup crew except for Mattingly, and he was supposed to fly. A big debate for a couple of days, and finally they decided it's too dangerous. If he gets the measles at the moon, he could be really, really sick.
Yeah.
And will he be able to carry out his duties? So they took him off, substituted Jack Swigert, and Mattingly came back on our crew. Well, to this day, he's never had the measles, but so he could have gone. But it was a medical decision, but it worked out. That flight showed the training regime was so rigorous and so identical for prime and backup crew that a week before the launch, a guy could come in there and take over, and then they have a cohesive crew in a week.
Yeah.
And it worked. And Mattingly he was disappointed, of course.
Sure.
But then he had a full mission with us on 16. And Swigert did a fantastic job. The Apollo 13 movie, Houston, we have a problem, whatever it was, didn't do him justice.
Yeah.
It showed him just not quite competent, but that wasn't true.
Yeah, and I'm sure that it got Hollywoodized, if you will, because those guys, for the amount of training that you went through and all of that, there's way more competence than they could possibly attempt to show in a movie.
So Swigert actually, before he was selected as an astronaut, worked for North American Rockwell on the command module.
Oh, wow.
They had the contract, and he had developed all the emergency procedures for the command module. So, he was well trained.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I helped him codify the emergency procedures in the early days.
So you flew on the Apollo 16 mission. What were you doing during the Apollo 14 and 15 missions?
Training.
Training for 16?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right after Apollo 13 recovered, we had a pilots meeting. All of the astronauts attended. We had this meeting every Monday. Dick Slayton came in, and so they announced the 15 and 16 crew, which was John Young, myself, and Mattingly. And so we started training. NASA decided that the last 3 missions would be scientific missions, and they would delay the schedule to enlarge the lunar module so it would stay 3 days rather than 24 hours. And we'd have a rover. We'd have a car so we could cover more area of the moon doing science. And so that delayed 15, 16, and 17 a couple of years. And so we trained for after 13, which was early 1970, if I recall, for 2 years. So we finally launched in April 1972. So it was a long training.
Yeah.
It doesn't take you that long to get ready, but you ramp up like a football player. You ramp up to your max proficiency, and then you got to hold that level through the season.
Right.
And so that's what we were doing, is continue to train.
When you're getting ready for the Apollo 16 mission, and you got sick again, and one of the things that I was looking into was that during that time, in light of what happened, them replacing Mattingly on the 13 mission, NASA had made the decision to. Did they make the decision to postpone but keep the same team?
The postponement was not as a result of my getting sick. I had pneumonia, and I went in the hospital on 1 January or 2 January 1972 at Kennedy Space Center. at Patrick Air Force Base Hospital. And the vehicle was actually on the launch pad. We were going to launch in March. Mm-hmm. So I was in the hospital for a week, and I had basically 2 months, I thought, to get back into shape.
Yeah.
So there was no discussion of removing me at this point if I showed progress of getting physically fit.
Right.
But fortunately, they had a problem on the launch pad with the vehicle, and the only way to fix it was to roll it all the way back into the assembly building.
Wow.
And so that delayed us another month. So instead of March liftoff, we had an April liftoff.
Yeah.
So that gave me another month to get ready, get back in shape.
Right.
And so there was never any discussion that Charlie Duke was going to get kicked off, unless I had a relapse or something like that. But I was okay. And then Mattingly came on, and then we had a backup crew, which was actually most of the Apollo 14 crew was our backup. Because after 17 crew was selected, they had 3 vehicles, 18, 19, and 20. NASA canceled those. So the crews that were selected for those missions lost their job, lost their chance to go. And so being backup for 17 was a dead-end job, but who knows? Maybe they get sick and we get to go again. So John and I volunteered. Mattingly didn't want to do it, but Stu Rusa from Apollo 14 said, I'll do that. I might get to go again. So we trained, but they stayed healthy and we didn't get to fly again. So.
Yeah. You were on Capcom for 11, and then you go up for 16. How much did the technology change between those 2 missions?
Not very much. We had to learn how to operate the rover, deploy the rover. We had to learn how to, since we were going to do 3 moonwalks, we had to learn how to, in the spacecraft, where to stow the suits, how to get dressed again, because we took our suits off after every EVA. And so now we're just in our basically shirt sleeves.
Yeah.
So you got to make sure everything's stowed right. You got to make sure you're recharged and all of that stuff. So the procedures and we spent a lot of time learning how to do that and perfecting that procedure. So it's just a matter of just continued training.
Sure.
And we were ready to go. I mean, after 6 months, we were ready to go, but the rover wasn't ready, and they had to modify the lunar module to make bigger tanks, more oxygen, more fuel, because it was going to be heavier. The production side took longer than it took us to get ready to go. So we just reached that level and kept training.
Yeah.
And just over and over and over again. The only downside of that was that if you got sick again or you had an accident and broke a leg, you were going to lose your spot. So you had to be very careful.
Yeah.
We lived in Houston, but the training was all in Florida, or some geology trip somewhere. And so we were gone all the time, and 5 days a week. And that was hard on the families. And the boys were, by the time I flew on 16, they were 5 and 7 years old. So they had 2 years of their dad not being there, basically, which was a tough time.
Yeah.
But you were so motivated, though. I'm going to get to go to the moon. I'm going to get to go to the moon. And so you put all that other stuff behind you and you focused on your training.
Yeah, I'm sure your kids were bragging about it at school, that your dad was going to get the opportunity.
Well, it was actually, I tell the story about my dad. He couldn't believe his son was going to go to the moon. He was born 3 years after the Wright brothers.
Yeah.
So he'd seen a lot of progress in aviation. Well, our boys were young, and I guess I say they didn't think it was any big deal. The whole neighborhood was going to the moon.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
They had Bill Anders was our next door neighbor. He was on Apollo 8. Neil Armstrong lived a block behind us, and Apollo 11, and then Tom Stafford, John Young, Frank Borman, Stu Rusa, myself, Ron Evans. We all lived in El Lago.
It's a good neighborhood.
But they were riding the bikes, and we just had a great neighborhood. So everybody's they said, "Dad, when are you going to go?" Basically,
It's almost an expectation more than it was a privilege at that point. That's funny. Well, we've got a couple more questions about your NASA career. We'll take a quick break and then we'll come back. All right, we are back with astronaut Charlie Duke, and I'm excited to talk about this part, the Apollo 16 mission. So you had mentioned that this was a little bit more of a scientific mission. You were gathering samples. You got to take out the Lunar Rover. What were some of the other things that you were doing, or what were some of the things that were part of that mission?
our mission was targeted into the lunar highlands. Nobody had ever landed in the lunar highlands, so they wanted to see if the rocks and what the difference was with the rocks in the Mare where Neil Armstrong had landed. So our landing site was selected almost in the center of the moon, but it was 8,000 feet above where Neil Armstrong had landed. And if you look at the moon, it's in the white area. Mare, most of the Apollo landed in the dark area, the Mare. And so we were up in the mountains of the moon to explore and collect samples to see the variety of moon rock. To assist us, we had a little rover, electric car that we carried, actually unfolded it to get it operational. We had an experiments package, and it was 2 seismic experiments, a heat flow experiment, a magnetometer experiment, and one other. And so we put those out and then turned them on, and then Mission Control received the data, and we just forgot about them. But then we'd started our exploration, and we had a traverse that went from point A to point B, point C, and in a sort of a big loop, if you will, tear-shaped. One was to the west, one was to the south, and one was to the north on our 3-day excursions, the 3 excursions. And we had a series of experiments that were designed by geologists and other scientists to not only collect rocks, but to sample soils, do penetrometer tests, do trenching, drilling. We had to learn all of that. So it was a big scientific effort. Since you're there 3 days, you get to collect a lot of rocks and a lot of soil samples. They were really surprised. The rocks weren't what they thought. They thought there were going to be more volcanic, but there were hardly any volcanic rocks up there. So they got very excited. This is a whole new area of rocks and exploration. The first excursion was going west about several kilometers to a crater called Plum Crater, which is about 20 meters or about 60 feet across, about maybe 30 feet deep. So we explored that area of the moon, did our experiments out there, collecting the samples and bagging the samples. And so that basically every stop was similar things, some different experiments to gain as much scientific data as possible about the Descartes Highlands or the Highlands of the Moon. And it was very successful. We lost one experiment due to an electrical problem, but everything else was tremendous. We collected like over 200 pounds of lunar rocks and soils while we were there. And the lunar surface is very, very fine dust, if you will. And actually it's pulverized rock because there's no organic material on the moon, so there's no dirt like we have down here on Earth. It's just pulverized rock. But everywhere you walked, you left your footprints. So you never worried about getting lost on the moon. We travel 3-4 miles away, and if you, well, where are we? Just turn around and follow your tracks back, and you're gonna get home. So each day was different area, sort of mostly similar experiments, but some different. We finished up on North Ray Crater, which was a huge impact crater. It was like 500 yards of diameter and maybe 100 yards deep. And we drove up to the edge of the rim of that crater, parked the car, got out, and we started our geology. And I had a 500 millimeter lens camera moving around, click pictures of the far side of the crater. And it was 500 yards in diameter and about 100 yards deep. It was so steep, you couldn't see the bottom. If you fell in, you couldn't get out. So we didn't get within 2 yards of the edge.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want it to slough in or just accidentally fall in.
Right.
Anyway, we had a lot of interesting rocks and a lot of interesting experiments we did. And so geologically, it was really a gold mine for Apollo, because it's the only mission that landed in the mountains of the moon. Everybody else landed either on the Moria or on the edge, which was mostly volcanic rocks in that area. We had the rover revolutionized it. We traveled about 17 miles. Farthest we got out was about 4 miles. And we limited that radius to ourselves because if the car broke down out there, you had to walk back.
Right.
And we felt like we could walk back 4 miles. Now, the car got so reliable that on the last mission, they were able to go 7 miles out and back because they trusted the car was going to operate. It's an electric car, 2 batteries. Each wheel had its own electric motor. Very, very powerful little car. And it would climb a 25-degree slope.
Wow.
Very maneuverable, but it was skittish. It only weighed like 60 pounds, or maybe 70 pounds up on the moon. And it was very sensitive steering. And as John was driving and I was navigating, we kept doing this like fishtail, all the time. And one time we spun out once, but it never felt like it was going to roll over on you.
Yeah.
It had very good low center of gravity.
Yeah.
So we enjoyed driving. We had seat belts.
That's good.
We had to suit up, buckle up before we started out. John drove and I navigated. I had a set of maps, directions and distance, and then we'd see these landmarks along the way that we were going in the right direction. And while we're going underway, we didn't have TV, so I'm sitting there with my camera, and every 50 yards I'd take a picture. I'd twist to take pictures off to the side, and I was the travel guide. So Mission Control wanted to know what we were seeing, what the terrain was like, bumps and hills and valleys, and all of that stuff. So I was describing the terrain as we passed over.
Yeah.
And every 50 meters. So they would have, when they developed the film, they could match the film to my commentary, which helped a lot.
One thing that you mentioned that I find so incredible is not only, because when I think of going into space, I think of the physical requirements that it takes, the ability to withstand G's, the shape that you have to be in. But there's this whole other side of geological training that you had to go through as well that, may even be equal to the amount of physical training that you have to go through. So what were some of the geological training exercises that you went on to prepare for that?
Well, every month we had a 2 to 3 day trip on geology. And we did a lot out on the West Coast, California and Oregon. We did Arizona, New Mexico, the Big Bend in Texas, and mostly was some igneous rock, but mostly volcanic. Then we did Hawaii, 5 trips to Hawaii, the Big Island where the active volcano. They designed traverses. We'd get out there and we'd always go with an expert. They would design these walking traverses if the terrain was suited. We had a rover that we could drive.
Yeah.
And the objective was to identify these unique characteristics that they knew about, but this is the first time we'd ever seen it. So it was really good training. And I guess by the time we flew, which was 6 years, we'd been doing geology 6 years, and I had equivalent of a master's degree in geology. So we were well trained in field geology. We couldn't do analysis in the labs, but
Sure.
we could pick up a rock and describe the rock accurately. The whole purpose was to get you to train your eye to see unusual variations that were in that area that you would then take to the moon with you, and you could look at rocks and difference and identify variety, if you will. And I tell everybody in geology, basically, rule was pick up one of every color. Well, on the moon, there were gray ones, white ones, and black ones. That was about it. But the gray ones had a lot of variety. And so you'd want to get these rock breccias, they call them. And you see little inclusions of other rocks in this matrix of a moon rock.
Yes.
And so we were well trained. What we found on the Descartes Highlands was different than they told us. They had briefed us that we were going to have two volcanic flows that met in the valley, and we were to sample back and forth across this. There weren't any volcanic rocks. So they got really excited when they realized that, hey, this is something really unique in Apollo rocks. We've never seen anything like this before. So as we were picking up rock, they were showing us which ones. Sometimes they'd point to TV and say, pick up that one over there. But generally we were on our own, and we selected stuff that we could see the detail in. And so it turned out really, really good. We had a real suite of the rocks, and I'm so glad we were so well trained in geology. It was worth all of the trips that we took and learned. We took trips to Canada. Some crews went to Europe. Basically, every week we were in a different area. And we went 5 times to Hawaii because it was so variety of volcanic rocks. And that was a nice place to visit.
Yeah, I could be okay with going to Hawaii 5 times. Well, I know that there's really an endless amount of questions I could ask you about, some stories about being on the moon, but what's one story that you like to tell people about? It could be funny, it could be, spiritual, it could be really anything that that you like to tell people about being on the moon.
I get some questions about, did it change your life? I said, no, that didn't, but I had an experience with Jesus 6 years later, and that was really a life-changing event. People say, well, what is it like on the moon? And I get to describe what it was like walking. Being in a pressure suit, Apollo suit, you couldn't bend at the waist. You could jump up a little bit, and you came down, that you had a convolutes in your knees. You could bend your arms, you could squeeze your gloves, but it was basically a stiff suit. And so you had to learn how to operate this suit in 1/6 gravity. And it was easy to lose your balance. And so several times I fell down front. And then if you were down on your stomach, you did a series of push-ups, and took you about 3 push-ups to rock yourself up.
Yeah.
But the moon dust was turning your suits gray. And because it was clingy, you couldn't get it off. It was so fine-grained. I guess one of the things that I share a lot with the people is being on the surface of the moon. We were at the end of the stay, and I had a picture of my family that I dropped onto the moon.
I've seen that picture. It's very famous now.
Yeah, very, very famous picture. Our boys were 5 and 7 at the time, and so it was really just a family shot. To close out, everybody wanted to do something very special. Alan Shepard played golf on the moon, and Dave Scott did a hammer feather gravity trick. And so we were going to do the Moon Olympics. And the Olympics were in Munich that year.
Right.
So we were up in April, so we were going to do the Moon Olympics. And we decided to do the high jump. And so down here with all my gear on, I weighed 360 pounds. Up on the moon, I weighed 60 pounds. Well, I was in shape, and so I could, I had strong legs, and so John and I started to bounce And unfortunately, I forgot that the backpack weighed as much as I did. So when I jumped, I straightened up, and the center of gravity went that way, and I went over like this.
Oh, man.
And that was scary because if the suit breaks, I'm dead. So I tell everybody I had a moment of fear, but fear is not bad if you don't panic. Get your adrenaline going,
Right.
and you
Get focused. Yeah.
focus. The thought occurred, do something, roll right. And so I had this thought, and I rolled to the right as I was coming down and broke my fall on my right hand and my right foot, bounced onto my back, and my heart was pounding. But I'm still alive.
Yeah.
Suit held together, and we had a pressure gauge. John helped me up, and we had a pressure gauge on the suit here on the left wrist, and it said normal. And we had a remote control unit that attached to your suit here, and it had quantities and electrical battery power and stuff like that. And everything were at normal, and I began to calm down. Then I looked up, and the TV camera was pointed right at me. And Mission Control was very, very upset that with this high jump deal. So the Capcom said, no more moon Olympics, guys. Get back inside, clean up, and get back inside. So we wiped down as much as we could. That ended our stay on the moon. And people are curious. And I learned a very important lesson. Is never do anything in space you haven't practiced on Earth.
That's a good lesson. I'm sure that's a lesson that not a lot of people will get to put to practice, though. Well, I have one more question just to kind of wrap up this section of the podcast. But what are you excited about in space travel today? Is there anything that really has your eye? Something that we should be paying attention to a little bit more?
Well, the new moon mission that NASA's planning is called Artemis.
Okay.
And Artemis has been on the unmanned launch vehicle. It's been on the pad for a month or more, and then they had to roll it back in. No, they left it out there, but then when the hurricane came, they had to bring it back in. Now they get it back out. And we were supposed to launch last week, but it's been canceled to next week. And just like Apollo, you only have one launch window at a time. Per month, I should say. So they're getting ready to launch Artemis, and Artemis is the sister of Apollo.
Right.
And so it's an Apollo mission, and it's unmanned, but it's taking all the equipment to the moon and go into this tremendous lunar orbit to test out all of the equipment except for the lander and the car. They're not going to take a car with them, of course, or the lander, since it's not going to be a landing mission. And then they're going to go out and orbit the moon. And the mission, depending on the time of launch, can be, let's say, 20 days up to 42 days. It'll be the precursor of the first manned Artemis mission to return to the moon. And sometimes in the next several years, it will have a lander developed, tested, and they'll have a crew that will land on the moon. At that point, I won't be the oldest guy that landed on the moon anymore.
It'll be a bittersweet day.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm excited about it, and it's going to be NASA's. I see NASA is focusing on deep space with Artemis in preparation to a Mars mission, maybe in 20 years or so. Let's build a space station on the moon, scientific base, and start doing science and manufacturing and assembly and stuff like that on the moon, where we're close enough where if you have a problem, you can talk to Houston and they can help you out, send supplies or send something up there, which would come in a reasonable time. And I think that experience will give us enough knowledge to then go on to Mars as a follow-up after that with a different system. I think Mars is going to be very, very difficult, manned flight. Couple of years, maybe a year and a half. Challenges as far as environmental concerns and health. Do you have a doctor on board? Do minor surgery? All of these things that can develop on a journey to Mars. And once you leave Earth orbit, bye-bye, you're on your own. Whereas the moon, you can launch at least a backup, a replacement part or
Sure.
something. Whereas Mars, you got to have it all planned out and it's got to all work. So NASA's focusing on deep space, as near as I can tell, and near Earth orbit is going to be the SpaceX's, the Blue Origins, the Virgin Galactic, and Boeing and others having near space stuff, and I think that's good. I think we're going to see a lot of ingenuity from private sector. Mm-hmm. We'll get manufacturing. We'll get colonization. Hotels in orbit, and it'll revolutionize space flight. Just like aviation has evolved over 100 years now, or more, you will see space flight do the same, I think.
That's incredibly exciting. And I think one of the things that this whole, this conversation and really doing the research about your career, what it's really brought to light in my mind is to retain that open mind. I think a lot of times you don't want to be on that side of history where you say, oh, that could never happen, right? You want to, it's really forced, or not really forced, but help me believe that if you get a good crew of people together that have a singular mission, you really can accomplish just about anything. And I think that's a huge takeaway from really my preparation in this interview with you, but also just understanding that teamwork is really the driving force behind all of that. Getting people united behind a single focus. A lot of incredible things can happen when that all comes into place.
I think the attitude with everybody in Apollo and subsequent has been, no matter what your job, if this thing fails, it's not going to be my fault. Mm-hmm. And so the focus and the attention and the teamwork that was developed in Apollo, Space Shuttle, and now Artemis is coming forward. And you see that attitude of dedication, planning and preparation, and all of the things that need to be integrated in this very complicated mission, started in all Apollo. And I think I see that now in all the missions that have gone before, like with Space Shuttle, now Space Station, and Artemis is the next plan that the U.S. is developing, which is all going to be deep space to the moon. And then probably a follow-on program past Artemis if we're going to be challenged to go to Mars. Mm-hmm. I think the success of Artemis is going to be key to eventually flying a flight to Mars. If we don't have the confidence in the systems that we're sending to the moon, it's hard to develop confidence in systems that you got to commit to a not one-way trip, but you got to have this thing planned. Once you leave, once you leave for Mars, bye-bye, you're on your own. Yeah.
Well, we're going to go ahead and take another break. We'll come back with part 2, where we're going to talk a little bit more about the supply chain of getting a man on the moon. For those of you who are listening to part 1, if you are interested in the supply chain, tune into part 2. Charlie will be with us, and we'll ask him a couple questions about specifically the Apollo project and how they were able to accomplish what they were. So thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you guys will tune in for part 2.